of their emissions units. Mr Chair.
Maggie Berry.
I move that the question be now put.
I'm going to call Gareth Hughes.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Kia ora, ngā mihi kia koutou, kia ora. Mr Chair, in the last month we've heard extremely disturbing news from the world of science. We're hearing the Arctic summer ice melt is happening faster and worse than science predicted. We've seen the impact of Hurricane or Superstorm Sandy on the Caribbean and the east coast of North America. Huge economic cost, huge people cost, even the marathon's been cancelled there. And in New Zealand we've seen our fair share of natural related disasters, in part caused by the more extreme weather that scientists are warning us that's happening from climate change. This is having real costs for farmers, real costs for horticulturalists, real costs for the New Zealand economy. And in my second reading speech, Mr Chair, I talked about my motivation for why I am voting against this bill, which is my kids, because I want my kids to grow up in a world with a stable climate. But what I want to talk in this contribution, dealing with part one of this law, is my motivation again for opposing this bill, which is the economy. Because the economy is a strong reason to be opposing this bill and a strong reason why our country should be advocating greater climate change action. Because the fact is, what this bill does and what an emissions trading scheme does, now we all know it's incredibly complex, very few people in the country actually understand what it is, an incredibly thick piece of legislation, incredibly complex, incredibly bureaucratic, incredibly rent-seeking behaviour we're seeing from certain sectors of the economy in New Zealand, something hugely complex, but basically what it is, it's a fancy way for saying we need a price on carbon. It's a fancy way for putting a price on carbon, trying to acknowledge the fact that there is an economic externality, which is carbon and the other greenhouse gases' impact on the climate and impact for our agriculture, impact for our economy. The whole point of a carbon price is to send an economic signal through our economy. It's trying to encourage consumers to invest in low technology appliances in their household, or maybe to take the bus or walk or cycle instead of driving, maybe purchase a more fuel efficient car. It's trying to send an economic signal to people with capital to invest in economic developments, so they invest in more efficient technology, so they invest in perhaps sustainable biofuels or wood chips for their milk dehydrator than digging up more low grade dirty coal. It's about trying to affect those investment cycles. And what we're seeing with the gutting that we've seen over the 4 years of the current government is not the right signal flowing through the economy, which is consumers investing in efficient devices, reducing their consumption of greenhouse gases. We're not sending those signals to people investing in our economy, to invest in afforestation, to invest in efficient appliances. In fact, we're sending the reverse message, which is through these subsidies, through the very clear signal this government is sending to them that to keep investing in dirty technology, keep investing in old-fashioned technology, keep polluting. That is the very strong economic signal this bill and the changes in this part send. And of course we can see it because we know our emissions have increased 25% above what our country promised, our Kyoto obligation, and we're seeing it in our deforestation rates and our planting rates. We're seeing what should be a very rational, very well predicted, economists obviously can and have modelled it. They're seeing exactly what you'd expect, which is when you send the signal to invest in old, dirty, polluting technology, people will. So the fact is, when we go through the history of this long debate in New Zealand, the fact is that everyone could acknowledge that climate change is a severe economic, environmental and social problem, a moral problem as well, that we acknowledged that we needed a signal on carbon to change some of those economic behaviours. We acknowledged, all the parties did, that it was a negative externality. And in 2008, Labour, in September of that year, passed the emissions trading scheme with support of the Greens. It wasn't perfect, I'm the first to acknowledge that, but it was essential that we do send an economic signal to send people the message to do the right thing. Now the fact was it wasn't the only lever that the government was using. There was also the thermal electricity ban, work around biofuels, work around public transport. Basically the way we were and the way we are going to deal with what's probably the greatest security challenge, the greatest moral challenge of our generation is to use all the levers. You're never going to solve it with just one lever. You need to have a price on carbon. You need to have community action. You need to have strong regulation, and you need to have people making a difference. And the fact is, people are making all sorts of changes to do the right thing in their lifestyles, but their government is telling them it's not important. We're actually going to continue to subsidise polluters. So what we see in this legislation, with the significant changes we see in Part 1, is a destruction, essentially, of the emissions trading scheme. My colleague, Dr Kennedy Graham, Mr Chair.
Gareth Hughes.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Calls it weakening it to an irrelevancy. Brian Fallow says it's putting the ETS into an induced coma. Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment calls it toothless and a farce. And Rod Oram, I think, says it most bluntly of all, which is, quite frankly, you're killing it. The fact is, what we're seeing with the changes in this bill in Part 1 is more offshore sham credits flooding our market. We're seeing some firms covering only 5% of the costs of, if you're a trade-exposed firm, 5% of their carbon costs. So for a firm will say $1 million in pollution-related expenses, the cost for them is $200. Mr Chair, that's a subsidy. We can have a debate with the Minister and the government benches about what a subsidy is. The fact is the taxpayer is picking up the tab, the taxpayer is paying. Now, if that's not a subsidy, I don't know what is, Mr Chair. We're sending the wrong message. We're seeing the changes in this part of the bill maintain those 1-for-2 surrender obligations past 2012. We're seeing that $25 price cap maintained indefinitely. We're seeing agriculture's inclusion put off indefinitely. I mean, Mr Chair, this is half of our country's emissions. We can rail against what other countries are doing or not doing on climate change. The fact is, in New Zealand, where half of our emissions are coming from the agricultural sector, we're not taking the responsible step. And in fact, we're taking the wrong step because we're not sending those signals for those farmers to invest in new efficient milking sheds or nitrification inhibitors or different ways of nitrogen and fertilising budgeting, Mr Speaker. And it's good to see the SOP 146, which deals with this. But the fact is, there's a whole bunch of negative changes, weakening, destroying the emissions trading scheme. It's good to see my colleague Dr Kennedy Graham has a number of very common sense, smart incentives to actually put our economy on the right foot. I guess the first thing is his amendment to Clause 5 actually puts it on a science footing, because what we're not hearing from the government benches, of course, is the science rationale for why they're making their changes, or how it's going to impact our gross and net emissions, or what it's going to mean for the climate. We're seeing with Amendment 69B putting the trade back into what's called a cap-and-trade scheme. We're seeing in Subclause 3 an actual floor, a $10 floor to the price of carbon, and of course we're seeing a restriction on the international units. Because what we're seeing through our economy is in fact a worsening of economic conditions, because our current account balance is of course going to continue to deteriorate. We're sending New Zealand dollars, hard-earned New Zealand dollars offshore to buy these sham offshore credits. We're sending the messages that we're going to purchase other people's emission reductions, not ours. We're investing in less efficient appliances, meaning we're importing more fuel. I mean, this is our biggest strategic threat to our macroeconomic situation, which is this $8 billion fuel bill, which is just not going to reduce under this legislation. We're seeing an actual a worsening of economic conditions. What we're seeing through this bill is New Zealand losing and continue to lose that green race that our most successful business leaders are warning us. For example, I was reading about a wave power device which, not the New Zealand government, the US Department of Energy is funding and trialling off their coasts. I was also reading today about the wonderful things New Zealand's doing for solar power in Tokelau. That's wonderful and I totally support it. But why on earth can't we do some good things about solar power in New Zealand? I mean, we're seeing changes to electric cars, and I've just met a fellow last week who can't get a meeting with this government. He's a world leader in electric car technology. He's being flown by President Obama to meet the White House, but this government won't do it. So those economic signals which this bill sends, the direct actions this government is taking, is sending Kiwis the wrong messages. Sick of in a red jersey, you might get a call open with the Prime Minister, maybe an apology. The fact is, these subsidies, this $1 billion in the last financial year we're spending on emissions trading credits, all the seismic survey, all the picking winners we are in the oil and gas sector, the fact we're flogging off the energy assets. Mr Speaker, we could actually be addressing climate change. We could be using the amendments that Dr Kennedy Graham has put in to switch our economy. We could actually keep our assets, supercharge them. We could be a world leader, not only in addressing climate change, a world leader in exporting clean technology, green technology. The world's crying out for it. In fact, in the last year, international investment in clean energy outstripped fossil fuels. Mr Speaker, it's like we're looking to the past for our economic rulebook when we should be looking to the future. The clean energy market's predicted to be an $800 billion industry, yet we're moving away from it. We're doing everything possible to tell New Zealand businesses and Kiwis not to invest in clean energy, not to develop the expertise to export and manufacture what is surely going to be the 21st century's economy. We're telling them to continue pollute. It's bad for our economy, it's bad for environment, it's bad for our kids and their future. Mr. Chair, we should do the right thing because it's the right thing, but we should also take action on climate change because it's in our economic self-interest. Kia ora, Mr. Speaker.
Tim McIntyre.
I move that the question be now put.
The question is that the question be now put. Those of that opinion will say aye. Point of order, Charles.
Chairman, I said during my earlier contribution that I would seek leave to table a letter, and I omitted to do so. I seek that leave now.
After I put the vote, the member can. The question is that the question be now put. Those of that opinion will say aye. To the contrary, no. The ayes have it. Party votes called for. Ask the clerk for a party vote.
New Zealand National.
59 votes in favour.
New Zealand Labour.
32 votes against.
Green Party.
14 votes opposed.
New Zealand First.
8 votes opposed.
Māori Party.
3 votes in favour.
Mana.
1 opposed.
Act New Zealand.
1 vote in favour.
United Future.
1 vote in favour.
Any other votes?
Members, the ayes are 64, the noes are 55. The question will be put. Point of order, Charles Chevelle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'm sorry, my apology. I did say I'd put the vote first. So, members, we move on to the vote on part 1. We have the Minister's amendments as set out on SOP number 145. The question is that the amendments be agreed to. Those of that opinion will say aye. To the contrary, no. The ayes have it. Party votes called for. I ask the clerk for a party vote.
New Zealand National.
59 votes in favour.
New Zealand Labour.
32 votes opposed.
Green Party.
14 votes opposed.
New Zealand First.
8 votes opposed.
Māori Party.
3 votes opposed.
Mana.
1 opposed.
Act New Zealand.
1 vote in favour.
United Future.
1 vote in favour.
Any other votes?
Members, the ayes are 61, the noes are 58. The Minister's amendments are agreed to. We come to Moana Mackey's amendments providing for transitional phase-out of the 2-for-1 surrender of units and the transitional carbon cap price as set out on SOP number 144. The question is that the amendments be agreed to. Those of that opinion will say aye. Contrary, no. The noes have it. Party votes called for. Ask the clerk for a party vote.
New Zealand National.
59 votes opposed.
New Zealand Labour.
32 votes in favour.
Green Party.
14 votes in favour.
New Zealand First.
8 votes in favour.
Māori Party.
3 votes in favour.
Mana.
1 in favour.
Act New Zealand.
1 opposed.
United Future.
1 opposed.
Any other votes?
Members, the ayes are 58, the noes are 61. The amendments are not agreed to. We move to Dr Kennedy Graham's amendments as set out on SOP number 147. These have an impact on the government's fiscal aggregates and were not lodged 24 hours before the House met and so are out of order. We now move to Moana Mackey's amendments requiring 50% of units surrendered to the New Zealand units as set out on SOP number 142. The question is that the amendments be agreed to. Those of that opinion will say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. The noes have it. Party votes called for. Ask the clerk for a party vote.
New Zealand National.
59 votes opposed.
New Zealand Labour.
32 votes in favour.
Green Party.
14 votes in favour.
New Zealand First.
8 votes in favour.
Māori Party.
3 votes opposed.
Mana.
1 opposed. 1 in favour, sorry.
Act New Zealand.
1 opposed.
United Future.
1 opposed.
Any other votes?
Members, the ayes are 55, the noes are 64. The amendments are not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, point of order.
Dr. Kennedy Graham, point of order.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd be very grateful if you were able to explain the distinction between SOP 144, which involves changes to the price cap,